We're talking about a public order emergency as defined in the Act. So, let's look at the definition. And the words, as is always the case when you're dealing with law, the words matter. The words matter. They define the line between lawful and unlawful. So here's the definition of a public order emergency. It means an emergency that arises from threats to the security of Canada that is so serious as to be a national emergency. Now, as is so often the case in statutes, you have definitions that have terms that are themselves defined. So one of the requirements of meeting this threshold for a public order emergency is to have a national emergency. What does national emergency mean in the statute? It means this. It means an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that is either A or B. And here's A, and I'll tell you B. A is this. A, it seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is of such proportions as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with. That's A. B is seriously threatens the ability of the government to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. Now, those are the two choices. It's got to be A or B. And in this case, I'll get to in a minute, the government has chosen A. So forget B. And the final bit of that definition is, and that cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. Okay, so we're racking up requirements here. What do we have so far? Number one, in order to be validly invoked, there has to be a public order emergency that, number one, threatens the security of Canada. Number two, seriously endangers the lives, health, and safety of Canadians. Number three, exceeds the capacity or authority of a province to deal with. And number four, is not able to be effectively dealt with under any existing laws. If you do not meet all of those four things, you have not met the threshold of a public order emergency. Now, that's the statute. That's the statute that has existed since 1988. Now we get into what the Trudeau government has actually done. The first thing they did is proclaim, invoke, declare that they were using the Act. And in that proclamation, they have identified, as they are required to do, the emergency they are acting on. How do they describe it? Well, in several parts, but here's the key one. The emergency is activities that are directed toward or in support of threat or use of acts of serious violence. The emergency is serious violence. That's what the government has said. For the purpose of achieving a political or ideological objective. That's the basis for the regulations that they have now made. One providing for emergency measures on the ground, and one providing for economic measures, like freezing of bank accounts. So the question is this: is that a valid invocation of the Act? Well, just this morning, in response to a report, the Minister of Public Safety was asked what the basis was, whether or not they had intelligence about the violence or the weapons. Because after all, keep this in mind, there has not been any violence in Ottawa from the convoy. There has been no violence. And so there must be some kind of evidence that indicates that there's going to be violence, there's going to be a threat of violence, because here again is the words. The words are in the proclamation: the threat or use of acts of serious violence. In response to the question from the reporter, the minister said that there was no intelligence of the existence or presence of weapons in downtown Ottawa. And in fact, what he said instead was that the basis for the government's actions was rhetoric. Rhetoric. It was speech. It was the expression of an ideological position. Now, just for a moment, consider the implications. This is a government that has invoked an emergency statute on its own admission on the basis of something that somebody has said. They have no actual violence occurring. They have no intelligence about threats of violence occurring. I'm sure you can work out what the consequences are if this is to be considered a proper use of the Emergencies Act. Now, let's just take a bigger picture just for a moment. I don't want to get too far into this, and I don't want to take up too much time. But just for a moment, consider this. The ideology that is now in place in our political realm is one in which language is being redefined. There's all kinds of terms that don't mean what they used to mean. Racism, for example. But included in that list are some very important terms that are very relevant here, like freedom. Freedom now means, apparently, safety. The rule of law means governments taking control of things for, quote, proper outcomes. And one of those words that have been redefined is violence. Violence can now mean words. Honking has been called violence. And they now are taking that literally. They have said they're proceeding against violence, and what do they have? They have words. They have rhetoric. They have an expression of a political position. And it is that rhetoric, it is that political position that they are afraid of. And that constitutes the emergency. And in a way, you know it does. It does constitute an emergency for them. Not within the meaning of the Emergencies Act. That does not meet that threshold. But in political terms, you can kind of see how this might be seen by them as an emergency. So I'll leave you with this thought. If this invocation of the Emergencies Act is valid, then governments have the power to declare emergencies and crush any peaceful protest, any dissent that threatens their political fortunes and ideology. And that's not the kind of country we want to live in. Thank you.